Hello everyone, I'm back at it again. I picked up some ice rod blanks from Baskang. I've never used them before, but I've heard good things about them. And I thought today we'd go through how to make an ice rod from start to finish. Now this is a pretty lengthy process. I'm going to have to fast forward through a couple of parts. But this is how they show up at your door in a box. They're taped together and there's nothing on them, right? They're just rod blanks, no eyelets, no handles, nothing. And I can tell one of them's a little thinner than the other. I'm pretty sure that's the panfish rod, and the one that's a little bit thicker is a perch rod. So one of the first things you need is some kind of handle. I like cork handles, but you could get EVA foam handles. You could use a lot of different materials for handles, and sometimes you can have split grips. They sell these ice rod guide kits, and they're okay, but you've got to remember they don't come with a tip top. So you either need to use one of the guides as your tip top and wrap it on, or buy a tip top separately. Another thing you need are these winding checks. These are small rubber winding checks. I cover those with epoxy because they will crack eventually because they're just made out of rubber. And these are little thin tip tops. These are fly rod guide tip tops. I like using fly guides for my ice rods. I think they resist icing pretty well. They're easy to clear and they're pretty cheap. They're about $1 each. And I got some stripper guides too. These are wire stripper guides. Okay, next thing to do is to get the rod blanks apart. And I'm just going to very carefully slice that masking tape and kind of unroll them. Sometimes the shipping and the unpacking process is the most dangerous part. They have a little bit of tape residue on them. I just rub it off, but if you had a lot of tape residue, you could use some rubbing alcohol on there to clean up the blank. I think the PF stands for panfish. I'm going to carefully slice that off too. This part isn't as critical because it's going to be inside that cork handle. For the thinner rod, which is the panfish rod, I'm going to use the smaller cork handle. And then for the thicker rod, the perch rod, I'm going to use the bigger cork handle. And I'm just kind of getting an idea for how it bends. It's got the graphite rods and they have quite a bit of tip section. So I would call these fast action rods. A lot of the rods I've built recently have been glass rods. So these are a little different. And different can be good, especially maybe if you need more sensitivity or you're working something that you need more control over. Sometimes graphite's better. So I slid that winding check on because you need to do it at this stage. Otherwise, you don't have an opportunity to do it again. It's not going to go over the guides and you can't pass it from the butt end. And I'm just kind of sizing up where I want that cork handle to be. And if I'm going to use the bigger one or the smaller one, I'm just trying them on for size, really. But I want that smaller handle on the lighter rod, which I'm going to build out first. All right, next step is to put a few tape wraps around the blank above where the winding check is. So I've already done one of the rods. And this is to serve as a place to mark the rod. This is just how I do it. I should also say I'm not a professional rod builder. I'm kind of self-taught, so the way I do things might not be the way professionals do it. But I wanted to show you how I do it, and maybe this will inspire somebody else to make their own rods. It's really not that hard once you have the right equipment and tools. I mean, I guess that's like anything else. But if you have the right equipment and tools, Anybody can do this. And it doesn't have to be perfect to catch fish. The fish don't care about cosmetics. All right, so one of the first things you need to do, other than kind of dry fitting the components, is to check the spline of the rod. So fishing rods have a natural way that they want to bend because of how they're formed. And you can feel it. So as you push the rod tip into a carpet or a rug, I've got a rug in this case, you can feel the way it wants to naturally bend. And I'm going to mark that in 2 places with a Sharpie on that tape that I put on the blank. I used to do this in one place, and then at one point I lost one of the wraps, or I took it off, and so now I always do it in 2 places in case it lines up with a guide or a hook keeper or something and I need to remove that wrap and I don't lose the spline marking. So it'll have, every rod will have basically 2 spots it wants to kind of click into, and one is where it's upside down, and the other on the opposite side, 180 degrees, will be the way it wants to naturally bend. And so it's usually pretty clear, and you can feel it. You can feel it snap into place where it wants to bend. And spinning rods, the guides will be lined up with with those marks, so the rod will be bending down. Casting rods will have the guides on the opposite side. So, when you have a fish on, they're pulling with the direction of the spline. Now, I've bought production rods in the past from, major companies that were completely missplined. They were off 90 degrees. And I don't know if they didn't do this step, or they did it wrong, or they were just guessing. But it's really critical to get the spline of the rod you're building and to figure out which direction it wants to bend. If you do it, backwards, so you're off by 180 degrees and it's upside down, it's not as bad as being off 90 degrees. Because it'll still want to bend, it'll still want to flex, it just won't flex to its fullest potential. Anyway, once you have the spline marked, I'm just dry fitting again and making sure, yeah, that's the handle I want, that's where the winding check is going to end up. But the hole inside the cork handle is always too big for the ice rod blanks. And so what you need to do is build up what's called tape arbors. And I'm kind of guessing, just from memory, about how much I need on that ice rod blank. And if I don't have enough, I'll add a little more tape, do a few more wraps around the blank. And if I have too much, such that it doesn't want to slide in, I'll take a little off. And you want it to be snug, but not so tight that the tape is like peeling back. That might be a little bit too snug, but I will deal with that later. So most of the time, the way I do this is I do 3 tape wraps. And you got to get that diameter of the arbors essentially to match the inner diameter of the cork handle. And they're going to be a little different. Each one of them is going to be a little different because the ice rod blank and just generally fishing rod blanks have a natural taper to them. There's not that much taper in the butt section, but there is a little bit. So it's kind of trial and error at this point, but I'm going to get 3 arbors on there and go from there. All right, I got my 3 tape arbors on there, and with some little pieces of masking tape, I've covered up the top of the cork handle. There's a couple different ways you can do this. I originally started out with kind of paste epoxy, and the first 3 rods that I built failed. The paste epoxy failed in the handle. And so now what I use is clear Gorilla Glue. You could use other kinds of epoxy. I've had pretty good luck with this clear Gorilla Glue, and so that's what I use now. But as you are snugging up those 3 tape arbors into the handle, it's going to kind of squeeze out some of the glue or epoxy or whatever you use. I just wouldn't use paste epoxy. And so that little tape covering on the top of the handle just keeps the glue or epoxy from getting all over the top of the handle. Just a little trick that I've learned over the years, and it really does help minimize any kind of mess. And as I'm putting the handle on, I'm kind of spinning it. I'm trying to work that glue in. It's going to naturally want to fill in some of those gaps too, which is just a bonus. And I snug it on till it hits the end, but you don't want to push too hard. You can actually push the rod through the butt cap on that cork handle. I'm doing both rods at the same time, so this is actually the thicker rod, the heavier rod, the perch rod. But it's just as easy to glue up a couple handles at the same time as one, so I'm just doing it all at once. And then once this part is finished, I just let them sit up overnight. Most of the time-consuming aspects of rod building are just letting it sit overnight. So you don't have to do too much. Most of the work is already done. You just have to let the glue dry, or epoxy dry, or whatever it is. All right, I'm trying to decide if I need just another little dab of glue at the top of the rod handle there to secure the winding check, but I've squeezed just a little bit of glue out the top, and you know what, that's going to be good enough. I just want just a tiny amount of glue sticking out the top of the handle so that I can secure the winding check. And eventually I will run a bead of rod building epoxy over that winding check, so it will be doubly secured in the end. But for now, I just wanted it to have just a little bit of glue to keep it in place while it dries. And that's it. You just set them up to dry. I've got 2 rods to dry overnight, and I'll check back in the morning. All right, it's the next day. The cork handle is pretty much dry on the rod, and it's ready to start wrapping on bits and pieces. And one of those pieces is a hook keeper. We'll do the hook keeper first, and then we'll get to the guides later. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of file down the edges of that hook keeper. They're already pretty smooth, but I like to just file off a little bit more metal. And then at the very end, I go kind of against the grain. And what that does is make like a little micro lip at the edge to catch the thread. It's some little trick that I learned. So I'm filing it down, trying to smooth that transition so it's easier to wrap the thread up. And since I took off some of the paint, I'm going to just color it with black Sharpie. The hook keepers are kind of a personal preference thing. There's different styles of hook keepers, and there's different positions to put them in. So for this purpose, I want a closed loop hook keeper, and I like it on spinning rods to be down and to the left at like a 45-degree angle. And I like it a little bit further away from that cork handle than a lot of production rods are. And that's so if I ever fish a bigger soft plastic, there's plenty of room on the blank to put it on the hook keeper so it's not jammed up against the handle. And since I'm building this rod, I can customize whatever I want, and that's what I want. But the real beauty here is that you can customize whatever you want. So I got the hook keeper taped down to the blank. I'm going to do 2 wraps with the thread around the rod, and then I'm going to cross over those 2 wraps with the thread, and then start wrapping towards the tip. And I'm just going slowly at first, kind of pushing everything together with my thumbnail there. This is a hand wrapper, by the way. There's also power wrappers. I've seen some that are kind of homemade wrappers made out of wood. You need some kind of spool tensioners for the thread. And there's the tip of like a glass rod, that orange thing poking up. That is the tip of a glass ice rod that is creating more tension on the line to keep it tight as I'm wrapping the thread onto the hook keeper. I'm being careful not to overlap or cross over my wraps. And you can just go slowly. The hardest part is getting it up over the lip of the hook keeper or the guide, whatever it is you're wrapping on. Once you get over that transition and you have a few wraps down to secure it to the blank, you can start peeling off some tape. So I wrap up until that closed loop is almost flush with the thread. Right around there. And then what I do is I advance it's kind of like a guide at the bottom of the hand wrapper there. I advance the guide to be a sharper angle. And I do a spiral wrap through the hook keeper. Now you could also finish it off at the edge of the hook keeper and then wrap backwards on the other side. You could do it in 2 steps. But I find this works pretty well. I like the spiral pattern, and yeah, this is just how I do it. So I made the angle wider, and now I'm making it tight again so I get nice, tight, even wraps. And if you make a mistake, you can always go backwards a little bit and start again, or just cut everything away and start again. There's really no penalty. The thread's pretty cheap, and you're really just costing yourself a little bit of time. But that's okay. A couple nights after dinner, and you got yourself your own ice rod. And once you know how to build ice rods, which I think are the easiest to build, you can build anything, really. And I'm not artistically inclined at all. So you can get as fancy with these wraps as you want. For my purposes, I just want nice rods that I can fish with, that are set up the way I want them to fish. So I don't get too fancy with my wraps or inlays or anything like that. I just want a good solid rod that's set up the way I want to fish. And, I like oversized guides that resist ice up when fishing outside. And I like my hook keepers a certain way. I like cork handles over EVA foam. I like 1-piece handles instead of 2-piece. Yeah, so that's the real advantage here, is just being able to customize exactly what you want. Now we got the hook keeper on, and the next step is I'm trying to show the hook keeper there. If I could focus a little bit better, it'd be great. But the next step is to put on the first stripper guide. So we'll get to that next. All right, we got the hook keeper on, and now we're going to kind of size up where I want that first stripper guide. And there's a bunch of ways to do this. Baskang has a layout chart for different rods, and that's a great place to start. You could use another rod that had kind of similar dimensions that you liked the layout and use that as kind of a starting point for laying out the guides. What I like to do is after I get that hook keeper on, I like to tape the reel that I'm actually going to be fishing with to the rod with masking tape. And the masking tape doesn't hurt anything. It actually kind of protects the cork over like electrical tape, something like that. So I like to have the line coming off the spool intersecting with that first stripper guide at an angle that allows a smooth transition into the running guides. I hope that made sense. I don't like when you pick up a production rod, you put a reel on it, and there's like a 30-degree angle between the line coming off the spool and the line going through the running guides. It's an unnecessary point of friction and resistance. So if you take the time to figure out what guide is going to work best, this is kind of an inexpensive wire guide, but it was the only one that Bass Kang had in stock. And I'm just trying it out for size to see if I like how the line's going to go through that guide and roughly the spacing that I think is going to be the right kind of trajectory for the line coming off the spool. So basically I'm just dry fitting the guide and the reel before anything's epoxied down. There's nothing permanent here. I'm just testing things out, and if I don't like the way it looks or I don't like the way the line's going through the guide, I'm going to do something else, or I'm going to shift that guide and I can move it forward or back. I can get a bigger guide because I have a whole box of other parts that I've had for other projects, and we're just going to see how it looks. All right, I've got everything set up and the line's coming through the guide, but I'm not in love with it. I think it's a little bit too small, and I can't get the angle the way I want it because the guide's just a little bit too small. So I'm just going to take it off and try another guide. And the other guide I have is, I would say, a little on the larger side, but I'd rather be a little bit big with the stripper guide and instead of too small. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I've got the bigger guide on right now, and the transition from the reel to the rod is much smoother. Now I'm seeing how the rod bends at the tip. It's a pretty fast tip. It's got a fair amount of backbone with a soft tip, a soft thin tip, which is I guess what I wanted for panfish. But I'm just trying to think about how I want the spacing at near the tip top to, I don't know, protect the rod and distribute the load evenly when there's a fish on the line, and usually that means more running guides towards the tip. So what I do is I kind of figure out the spacing based on where the stripper guide is, the tip top, and then I gradually increase the distance between the guides for a fast taper rod like this. All right, I've got another rod that I built earlier, a couple years ago, and it's similar distance, and I think I want a similar layout. The stripper guide ended up a little bit further down the rod on this build. That's partly because of the rod size and which reel I'm using, and I'm just trying to get a rough idea of the layout by comparing what I've done before, which I really like, to what I have now. And once I have kind of a picture in my head of how I want it, I can start filing down those guides, making sure that guide foot has a nice smooth transition. And the last couple strokes I do the other way to make like a little micro lip on the guide foot, and that's to catch the thread. I mentioned that before, but it's easier to see. There, 1, 2, 3, and I'm just making like a little micro lip there. So yeah, I have kind of a mental idea what I want in my head, and one of the welds, or I don't even know what it was, glue on one of those guides failed, and I was thinking about trying to fix it, but it just split apart, and they're only about $1 each, and it's not really worth trying to fix. But you should probably have extra parts while you're doing this, because you might need them, and it's always good to have a little bit extra than too little. So I just grabbed another guide, and yeah, I'll just file that one down. But once I get them all filed and cleaned up, and I use a Sharpie to fix the areas where I took off some of the paint, then I can start taping the guides to the rod and get kind of a dry fit of how those guides are going to look. And I can use a yardstick to kind of lay out how I want it. Or like I said before, you could use a spacing guide from online or from Baskang. This is just how I'm doing it. And yeah, so let's go to the next step. Okay, I've got my guides kind of set up the way I want them to be. I've taped them in place. I've got a yardstick that's helping me with the transitions. And basically I'm doing an extra ½ inch between each running guide down to the stripper guide. And I'm trying to get that spacing just right. Doesn't have to be quite perfect. Really, you're the only one that would notice. The fish aren't going to notice if you're 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch off. But I just kind of want to get as close as I can to how I want that rod set up, and see if it makes sense to me. I'm going to flex it. I'm going to see what it's like under load. And I'm going to glue on the tip top. So I put a bead, and that's called a sight bead, onto the frame of the tip top guide. That's also a fly guide. They make great ice guides too. Anyway, I'm putting a little bead of super glue around the base of that tip top guide, and I'm going to glue a green sight bead. You could also use red or whatever color you have. I only have green and red beads. And I'm going to glue it down to the tip top and let it set up overnight. And I'm going to try not to glue it to anything else. I made a little mistake there. I was trying to prop it up with the metal file. I ended up gluing part of it to the newspaper there. But that's all right. I cleaned it up the next day. All right, so we got the tip top on. We've got our guides taped on. And the next step is to start wrapping. Okay, the next step is to wrap on our stripper guide. It's pretty much the same procedure as wrapping on a hook keeper. But what I'm going to do first is do a few decorative wraps with some silver metallic thread. This is completely optional. The fish aren't going to know if you have decorative wraps on or not. You can get as fancy with this stuff or as simple as you want. I'm putting in this little loop of thread, and that's so when I finish about, I don't know, another ½ wraps or something, I can run the line through the loop and then pull the loop, and that'll make like a nail knot of the thread to keep it in place. So that's what that little loop is for. They have some thread pulling tools. You can also use that. I just use little scraps of thread. So the key thing is to keep tension on everything while you're doing this step. And so I thread the tag end through the loop. I'm keeping everything tight. And then I grab that loop and pull the ends through the last section I just wrapped. It's probably around, I don't know, 6 or 10 wraps there. And that kind of going back underneath the thread keeps everything in place. Otherwise, it will just kind of unravel and won't hold in place long enough for you to epoxy it. So I got my decorative thread wrap there. I'm going to kind of clean it up a little bit with my thumbnail, just making sure it's even. Again, the fish are never going to be able to tell. I just want it to look a little neater. And then once that decorative thread wrap is in place, I can switch back from silver metallic thread to black thread. You can see on the hand wrapper it has this kind of primitive spool tensioning thing. There's a wing nut, a washer, a spring, and you could probably pretty easily create something similar out of wood. The actual mechanism on this one is a little wonky. It's hard to keep both thread tensions equal. So one's always a little bit tighter than the other, and I can never quite get them both dialed in at the same time, so I always have to adjust them both independently. It would probably be a little bit neater if these were separated. They're on the same threaded rod. So that's just the way this one works. There's a lot of different variations out there. But there's basically a bunch of screw eyes to run the line through. And then you run it through that the top of old ice rod. You can buy those little tensioners separately. So if you're going to build your own, you could buy one of those tensioners and get a bunch of screw eyes and some wing nuts and spring and some washers and build your own out of wood or whatever. So anyway, I'm back to my black thread. I'm going to do 2 wraps around the rod blank, and then I'm going to catch it by crossing over. And I'm going to do a few more wraps to kind of lock everything in place. And then I'll trim my tag. I don't know, I usually trim it down to about 1/2 inch and then just wrap over it. But the real key here is just keeping everything tight. As long as everything's tight, it's not going to unravel on you, not going to have any issues. And then it's the same thing. I have to go up the hill of the guide foot, just like it was the hook keeper foot. That's kind of the hardest part. I'm kind of using my hands to help me get up over that hill. And once you're into that transition, got to make sure they don't cross over. I just saw one cross over itself, so I have to kind of reverse or use my fingers to undo that crossover. You want nice, even wraps. And once I get up that hill, it'll be smooth sailing. I'm almost up that hill. Keep going, a few more wraps. Once I get that foot wrapped down tight, before I even get to the tape, now I don't really need the tape at all. The tape was just there to hold the guide in place while I was wrapping up the guide foot and to keep it roughly in place on the rod. Now the rest of it's pretty easy. This part goes very smoothly. Just trying to do some neat wraps. With a little practice, it goes pretty fast. Okay, we're going to fast forward a little bit. I wrapped up all the guides using the exact same procedure as the hook keeper and the stripper guide. It's a little trickier as you get further down the blank because the blank has more flex. So you have to use those rod stands. It's good to have a couple of those for some of the smaller guides and further down the blank. And this is a burnishing tool, it's called. It's basically just a piece of plastic rod that's used to kind of smooth out some of the wraps, especially going up the guide foot onto the rod, or I guess the guide. I don't know how you want to say it, but basically I'm just trying to smooth out some of my wraps. And that little tool works surprisingly well. There's a few little imperfections where I have just maybe a little tiny micro gap where the thread was going up that that guide foot or the hook keeper foot. And I'm just going to fill in anything that looks a little bit silvery with a black Sharpie. Again, this is completely cosmetic. The fish aren't going to know if you do this step or not. It just, I think, looks a little better. I could also be a little bit more careful or redo some of those wraps. But as long as the guide is on there tightly and where I want it, yeah, it doesn't really matter if it's completely perfect or not. Okay, we're at a milestone here. We're finally ready to take the spline marking tape off of the rod blank. I leave these in until I'm just about to do the epoxy, and then I take them off. So, and the reason for that is just in case something goes horribly wrong, I have to redo the guides. I still have that spline marking in place, and I always do 2 of them because on one build I removed the only spline marking tape that I had, and it was a big mess. It's harder to find the spline of the rod once the tip top's on because it won't, spin nicely on the rug anymore. And yeah, so I leave those on until the end, right before I'm about to do the epoxy. And the other thing that I like to do at this stage is write on the blank. And you can get special markers. By the way, I'll list everything in the video description. But these are, I think they're scripto markers, and they're specially made. I don't know if they're specially made for rod blanks, but they're made for I guess drawing on different materials. And you have to shake the pen and depress it for a couple seconds on newspaper. This one's a silver marker. I also have a gold marker. I usually just try to match whatever reel I'm planning on using. So like I did the decorative silver wrap because the reel has some silver in it. If it was a reel that had more gold, I use gold. I could get some more markers and do red, whatever it is that you're trying to match up. And so here I'm just writing the length of the rod, which is 37 inches. And it's a bass Kang, so I'm going to write BK. And it's a panfish rod, so I'll write panfish rod or whatever. And then once that dries, and it takes a while to dry, these special markers, they take a while to dry. It's not like a regular ballpoint pen. Once it's fully dried, I'll cover it with epoxy, and then it'll be permanently on that rod, protected by 2 coats of epoxy. I guess now is probably a good time to say that when I'm doing the epoxy, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes, I do 2 coats on everything without thread. So that would be, any kind of writing or like a decorative inlay or a sticker or something like that. And then I do 3 coats of epoxy, 3 thin coats of epoxy on everything with thread. So that would be the hook keeper, the guides, and that's just how I do it. And we'll jump to that in a sec. There it is. I don't know, you probably can't read that. It's a little better, but 37-inch BK panfish rod is what I've got there. Okay, we're up to epoxy. Moving right along here. So I've used a bunch of different epoxies, rod building epoxies, and the one that I like the best is the original. It's the original Flex Coat. You can buy this from rod building shops, or you can get it online. I think the last bunch of epoxy I just picked up from Amazon or some online retailer. And the way most of them work, I'm not going to say all, but almost all work, is it's equal parts A to B. And I do that by weight. So usually I aim for about 1 gram of the first component, part A. And then whatever I end up putting in the cup, I just double it, and that's my the number I have to hit for B. And for this one, the B epoxy is a little bit more yellow. On this scale, this is an old kitchen scale, I think. I have to be pretty quick because if I'm not quick enough, it just turns itself off. and then I curse at it softly for a few seconds, like that, and then I curse at it softly, and then move on with my life and just estimate. So you're trying to get 50-50, and those last couple drops were a little bit of a guesstimate, but yeah, if I'm too slow with the epoxy, it turns itself off. But that's okay. I'm pretty close, and the next two epoxy coats, I got it done before the scale turned off. I guess I'm trying to emphasize here is anybody can do rod building as long as you have the right equipment, and don't worry about being perfect at every single step, because the fish won't care. They really don't care. So you want to mix the A and B parts of the epoxy pretty well. You're going to introduce some bubbles, but I have a trick for that too that we'll get to a little bit later on, and that's to use a torch lighter to get some of the bubbles out. I should also say that this Flex Coat epoxy, it doesn't smell as much as some of the other epoxies. Some of the other epoxies I've used, they really stink. I mean, they can stink up a basement in no time flat. And this one, it's not odorless, but it's not as bad as some of the others. I've got a little heater next to me, and I'm just putting it on the heater for a few minutes just to warm it up from, it's pretty cold down here, and I just want to warm up that epoxy a little bit to get it closer to what should be room temperature. I've got a bunch of craft brushes there. I got those online too. I think I got a deal for 100 of them, and they're not the best quality brushes, so I'm just running my fingers through the brush to make sure none of the little hairs come out while I'm going to be using it to put epoxy on the rod. Yeah, that's something else I learned the hard way. So I've got my epoxy mixed up with a popsicle stick. There's still quite a few bubbles in there, and I want to get epoxy all through that little brush. And I should mention that that you need a rod turner, some kind of mechanical rod turner. When I was first doing this, I think I read something that you could just like switch the position every 15 minutes or half hour or something of the rod, and that turned out to not work well at all for me. The epoxy would drip off or collect, and you really need some kind of mechanical rod turner like this. The other thing I learned was that it has one switch on and off, but if you flip that switch a bunch of times, it will go either clockwise or counterclockwise. And for the first 6 months I was using it, I didn't realize it had two directions. But there's one switch for on and off, but if you flip it a bunch of times, eventually it will start spinning the opposite way. All right, so this is my first coat of epoxy. I'm putting epoxy on the writing that I did, and on that rubber winding check right at the top of that cork handle. And that's because if you don't cover the winding checks, the rubber winding checks, eventually they will crack from heat and cold and humidity and drying out in the winter. That rubber, just like any other rubber product, eventually over many years will crack. So now I always cover the winding checks with 2 coats of epoxy, and the writing with 2 coats, and then the guides get 3 coats, and then the tip top gets 2 coats because there's no thread, at least on this build, there's no thread at the tip top. All right, I've got epoxy on everything that needs epoxy, and the next step is to go over it with a torch lighter or a candle to try to get some of those bubbles out of the epoxy and to thin it out and make sure you have nice, even, thin coats. Now the trick here, well, number one is you want a little bit of air moving, so I got a fan going. You can't see it, it's off camera. But you don't want to get too close to the epoxy such that it starts smoking. That means you're way too close. So you're just trying to warm it up a little bit, get some of those bubbles out. You're not trying to set fire to the epoxy. Alright, once you've finished with the epoxy, you let it spin overnight, and I let them dry for 24 hours. And then the next night, you do everything again. You mix up parts A and B of the epoxy. I usually aim for about 1 gram of each. And if I have my speed a little bit better, I can get it done before that foolish scale turns off. And then it's just the same procedure. You're trying to do thin, even coats with the craft brush on everything that needs epoxy. And then you take a torch lighter or a candle to the epoxy and make sure it's not smoking. And then you let that spin and dry 24 hours. And then when you're all done with as many coats of epoxy as you need, for me it's 2 to 3, then I let it dry in place in the rod holder for another couple days, just so the epoxy is completely and totally dry to the touch, not sticky. You could probably cut that process down a little bit. I just like to be sure, and so I just let it sit. I turn the motor off on the rod turner, and I just let it sit with the guides down for a spinning rod, and I let it sit in place for a few extra days, just so the epoxy has a chance to fully cure. And in the end, you get a nice looking rod that you can take out fishing. So I'll list everything in the video description. I know there's lots of bits and pieces and equipment here. I'll try to cover all of it. Thank you all for watching. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya!